When Kim Ji-hyun, a rising K-pop journalist, sat down for an interview, she anticipated a lively discussion about the global influence of BTS. What she didn't expect was a moment so explosive it would bring down one of South Korea's most recognizable news anchors overnight. It happened live, not in a pre-recorded segment where producers could edit or smooth over the rough edges. No, this was raw, unfiltered, and unfolding in real time. Kim Ji-hyun had been invited on a Morning Soul, a popular talk show known for its hard-hitting debates and even harder-hitting hosts. The man across from her, veteran anchor Lee Min-jae, had built his career on pushing boundaries. His interviews were aggressive, his style relentless. He wasn't there to moderate, he was there to dominate. And today, his opponent was a young, passionate journalist who refused to back down. The segment started predictably. Lee pressed Kim on her stance regarding BTS's global dominance, accusing their fanbase, ARMY, of being overly obsessive and dismissive of other K-pop groups. Kim countered with facts, listing instances where BTS had broken records, bridged cultural gaps, and brought global attention to South Korea. It was tense but professional. For a moment, it seemed like just another spirited debate. But then, something changed. Lee leaned forward, his expression tightening. His tone, once measured, took on an edge. He was no longer debating, he was attacking. Groups like BTS, he said, his voice laced with frustration, are the reason the music industry is becoming shallow. They cater to the lowest common denominator, pretending to be artists when they're just products of a corporate machine. The studio went silent. Kim blinked, her posture still composed, but her eyes sharpening. She had handled aggressive interviews before, but this was different. She let the moment hang in the air before responding. "Excuse me?" Lee didn't back down. In fact, he doubled down. "You act like BTS is changing the world, but what they're really doing is selling out. Their fans..." He stopped himself, but it was too late. The damage was done. The energy in the studio shifted. The producers, once passively observing, now exchanged glances. The crew members stiffened, waiting to see what would happen next. And Kim? She didn't shout. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. She simply said, "Would you like to clarify what you mean by their fans?" The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lee hesitated for just a second, but a second was all it took. The cameras were still rolling, and the internet was watching. Lee Min-jae wasn't a man who backed down easily. His entire career had been built on controlling the conversation, steering it where he wanted. But this time, he had lost the reins. The moment those two words, their fans, left his mouth, something shifted. It wasn't just a poor choice of phrasing. It was the implication behind it. The kind of phrase that could be dissected, twisted, and replayed 1,000 times over. And Kim knew it. She sat back, folding her hands in her lap, giving him the space to either correct himself or sink deeper. Lee inhaled sharply. "I meant ARMY," he said too quickly. "People like you who push this narrative of BTS being untouchable, instead of acknowledging the flaws in their music." Kim tilted her head slightly. "So, just to be clear," she said, her voice measured, "when you said their fans, you weren't referring to anything beyond their dedication to BTS?" Lee's lips pressed into a thin line. He had been in the game long enough to know a trap when he saw one. If he pushed back, he risked confirming the very thing people were already thinking. If he admitted it was a mistake, he looked weak. So instead, he shifted the goalposts. "Oh, come on, Kim. Don't play the victim here." He let out a dry chuckle. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This blind loyalty. You know exactly what I meant, but instead of engaging with the actual argument, you'd rather twist my words and make it about you." Kim didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let him redirect. "I don't need to twist anything, Lee. Your words speak for themselves." A flicker of something crossed his face. Irritation, maybe even a hint of regret. But he was too deep in it now. He couldn't afford to backpedal. So he made a fatal mistake. You know what? Maybe if BTS spent less time pandering to their fans and more time actually making meaningful music, we wouldn't be having this conversation. There it was, a blanket statement delivered with arrogance, live on air. The silence that followed was suffocating, not just in the studio, but on the other side of the screen, where thousands, soon to be millions, were watching. Even Lee seemed to realize it the second it left his mouth. His lips parted as if to soften the blow, but it was too late. Kim let the words hang for a moment before responding. "Are you saying BTS doesn't contribute to the music industry, Lee?" He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. "I'm saying this constant glorification of their every move is exhausting." Kim nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, but her silence said everything. The damage had been done, and within minutes, the clip would explode across the internet. It didn't take long. The moment the segment ended, the first clips hit social media. A 15-second snippet of Lee Min-jae's words. Maybe if BTS spent less time pandering to their fans and more time actually making meaningful music, spread like wildfire. No context, no prelude, just that sentence. Within an hour, the hashtag started trending. Hashtag Fire Lee Min-jae, hashtag Media Bias Exposed, hashtag Kim Ji-hyun was right. Some took it at face value, blasting Lee for what they saw as outright disrespect. Others scrambled to defend him, claiming it was a misinterpretation. But the full-length clip didn't help his case. If anything, it made it worse. Music critics, industry insiders, and fans on both sides pounced. Some condemned him outright, while others spun it as yet another example of selective outrage. But no matter the stance, one thing was clear. People were watching, and then the sponsors got involved. By midday, 3 major advertisers for Morning Soul had suspended their partnerships, releasing carefully worded statements about reviewing their commitments to the network. By evening, 5 more had followed. It was damage control mode at the highest level. Lee, for his part, stayed silent, at least for now. But the network? They had a crisis on their hands. And Kim? She didn't have to say a word. She simply retweeted the clip, adding nothing but a thinking face emoji. But the storm wasn't over yet. Because now, the network had to make a decision. Inside the headquarters of SBS News, the network behind Morning Soul, executives were in full-blown crisis mode. The outrage wasn't dying down. It was intensifying. Viewers were flooding the network's email inbox, demanding action. Advertisers weren't just pausing sponsorships anymore. They were pulling out entirely. And to make matters worse, other networks had started piling on, using Lee Min-jae's comments as a case study on media arrogance. By mid-morning, an emergency meeting was called. The network had 2 choices: defend Lee and risk more fallout, or cut ties and protect their reputation. For years, Lee had been one of their star personalities, a veteran with a reputation for hard-hitting interviews. But now, he was a liability. At 3 p.m., an official statement was released. Lee Min-jae has been placed on indefinite suspension while we conduct an internal review of yesterday's broadcast. SBS News remains committed to respectful and fair journalism. It was corporate speak for "we're seeing how bad this gets before we throw him overboard." But the internet had zero patience for half measures. The suspension wasn't enough. People wanted termination, and Kim? She wasn't leading the charge, but she wasn't stopping it either. Later that evening, she appeared on another show where she was asked directly, "Do you think Lee Min-jae should be fired?" She paused, then said, "I think people in positions of influence should be held accountable for their words." It was measured, strategic, and devastating. Because the next morning, SBS News made its final decision. At 9:15 a.m., they announced, effective immediately, Lee Min-jae is no longer affiliated with SBS News. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors. The media world erupted. Some called it justice. Others called it an overreaction. But one thing was certain: Lee Min-jae was finished. And the conversation was only getting started. Lee Min-jae was gone, but the controversy was far from over. His firing split the country in 2. One side saw it as a long overdue reckoning. Proof that media figures couldn't talk down to one of the most influential groups in the world and get away with it anymore. To them, Lee's comments weren't just offensive. They were revealing. A glimpse into the condescending attitude that had defined mainstream media for decades. The other side called it cancel culture at its worst. So a man loses his job for one comment? A single misstep? What happened to debate? What happened to context? Conservative commentators took full advantage. Headlines on entertainment outlets painted Kim Ji-hyun as the journalist who took down Lee Min-jae. Meanwhile, left-leaning figures tried to distance themselves from Lee, but some were quietly uneasy. Even those who disagreed with him recognized the implications. Because if a veteran anchor could be fired overnight, who was next? And then Lee broke his silence. Late one evening, he released a pre-recorded video statement on social media. His face looked tired, his tone was calm but firm. "I was fired because I spoke the truth. The media doesn't want truth, they want compliance. If you step out of line, you're gone. If you challenge the narrative, they erase you. This isn't about me. It's about all of us." The video racked up millions of views within hours. His supporters rallied, calling for boycotts against SBS News. His critics pushed back, arguing that this wasn't some grand conspiracy. He had simply crossed a line. And Kim? She kept quiet. She didn't gloat. She didn't engage in the drama. She let the world argue for her. But this wasn't just about Lee anymore. This was about the future of media itself. The dust was settling, but the questions Lee Min-jae's firing had raised weren't going anywhere. In the days that followed, every major media outlet ran think pieces and panel discussions on what had just happened. Was this justice? Or was it censorship? Some saw it as a long overdue moment of accountability, a message that elite media figures weren't untouchable anymore. They argued that Lee's firing wasn't about free speech. It was about professionalism. Words have weight. When a journalist crosses a line, they face the consequences. Simple as that. Others weren't so sure. They warned that the real danger wasn't Lee Min-jae losing his job, but what it meant for the future. Are we punishing people for their mistakes? Or are we erasing people for having the wrong opinions? The debate stretched far beyond Lee and Kim. It became about the power of viral outrage, the role of social media in shaping reality, the fragile state of public discourse. And as for Lee, he was out, but he wasn't done. Within a month, he launched his own independent show on YouTube, branding himself as a truth teller silenced by the establishment. His audience? Larger than ever. Kim? She moved on, but her name would always be tied to this moment. She hadn't just debated a news anchor. She had changed the game. So, what does this mean for the rest of us? Was this justice served, or a dangerous precedent? Did Lee's firing restore accountability, or did it prove that public pressure controls the media? And most importantly, who decides what crosses the line? One thing is certain. This won't be the last time a moment like this happens. And when it does, the question remains, whose side will you be on? What do you think? Should Lee have been fired? Or was this an example of cancel culture going too far? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make you think.